Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Unkindness. I am your host, Raven in Full Feather, and this is my new podcast where I talk about all the weird and creepy things I like, such as true crime, paranormal happenings, cryptids, stuff like that. Generally, if it's something weird or creepy or even morbid, it'll probably end up being talked about here eventually. So, I don't really have a grand goal in creating this podcast other than I go down way too many rabbit holes and I just want a place to dump all this weird and strange information that I happen across. I am also going to go ahead and apologize now and drop a little bit of a disclaimer. I have two absolutely adorable little birds who love to go full on goblin mode as soon as I hit the record button. So I will try to edit them out if they get a little bit too loud at points. But yeah, if you hear any weird screeching or squawking, now you know why. All right, so today I am going to be talking about one of the great North American cryptids. And if you read the title, you know it's not Bigfoot. I decided I'm going to talk about the second most over explained one, and that is the Wendigo. So I'm sure a lot of you already know what a Wendigo is, but in this episode, I am going to explain this specifically for the people who have never heard one before. Hopefully, I also have some extra information to where even if you do know what a Wendigo is, you might learn something new. There's a little history lesson sprinkled in here at some point. All right, enough of my little spiel, and it's on to the Wendigo. So, a Wendigo is a creature that comes from Native American legend. It is a creature that is incredibly voracious. It has a ceaseless hunger. It can never be satiated. And its sole reason for existence is just to nom nom people. Specifically, the legend of the Wendigo originates from what modern anthology has grouped into the Algonquin language family. And this language family includes any of the Native American tribes from as far south as North Carolina to the northern areas of Quebec and Newfoundland, and from the east coast of USA and Canada to as far west as Montana and Saskatchewan. More specifically, it originates from the subgroup known as the Central Algonquins, and these are any of the Native American tribes that are around the Great Lakes and Plains, as well as the eastern forests of Canada. And to specifically name a few tribes in this subgroup, we have the Ojibwe, the Salto, the Cree, the Naskapi, and the Innu. I unfortunately cannot give you an exact time on when this legend came into existence, as the legend of the Wendigo was passed down through the oral history of these tribes long before any European settlers arrived. But what I can give you is the first historical written account of a Wendigo, which could be attributed to a French Jesuit missionary by the name of Father Paul Lejeune. And just to better understand how he created the first written account of a Wendigo, I feel like I need to explain the why. So, why Father Lejeune was in what is now modern day Quebec is he was tasked by his superiors back in Paris to try and convert the local Algonquin tribes to Catholicism. And he figured the best way to do this would be through education. He would push the other Jesuit missionaries in the area to try to teach the Algonquins to read and write in French while simultaneously attempting to learn their language and history. And as he was doing this, in the year 1636, he spoke to a local Huron woman. And he wrote down what the Huron woman said in a letter back to his superiors in Paris. And this is officially the first written account of a Wendigo. This devilish woman added that the Wendigo had eaten some Atacamagoken. These are the tribes that live north of the river that is called Three Rivers, and that he would eat a great many more of them if he were not called elsewhere, but that Atchin would come in his place to devour them, even up to the French fort, that he would slaughter the French themselves. So, for those wondering, an Atchin is pretty similar to a werewolf, at least physically, and I really wish I could find more info on it, but unfortunately, it's basically a legend that only exists within the Inuits. I'm now going to go into that little sidebar history lesson I mentioned earlier. So Father Lejeune was oddly progressive for his time, albeit for the right or wrong reasons. But I just found this to be a interesting bit of history and yeah, wanted to share it with you all. All right, so Father Lejeune believed that everyone was equal in the eyes of God, and he saw that it was the duty of the church to attend to everyone's spiritual and intellectual needs. So, on top of teaching the Algonquins to read, speak, and write in French, he would also extend this to French owned slaves. Predominantly, it would be the children of French owned slaves that he taught because they were allowed more leave time from their masters compared to the adults. And he would actually go and show a great deal of enthusiasm in doing so. He would also push other Jesuit missionaries to do the same. And by pushing them to do this, it would eventually lead to a push through the rest of the colonies to give everyone the right to education. So, this is where I was talking about. You might see it as a good or bad thing depending on your viewpoints. As a major driving force behind his belief in everyone's right to education was he saw it as a way to convert more people to Catholicism. And that concludes my little sidebar history lesson. I am now going to give you some physical descriptors of a Wendigo. There is a lot of ways a Wendigo is described as appearing. It really depends on who you're talking to, which group of people you're talking to, but I am just going to give you a few of them. The first one I have for you comes from just overall general Algonquin legend. And the way it's described here is it is a giant with a heart of ice. Sometimes it is thought to be entirely made of ice. Its body is skeletal and deformed with missing lips and toes. If we were to ask someone from the Ojibwe, they are going to say it was a large creature, as tall as a tree, with a lipless mouth and jagged teeth. Its breath was a strange hiss, its footprints full of blood, and it ate any man, woman, or child who ventured into its territory. And those were the lucky ones. Sometimes the Wendigo chose to possess a person instead, and then the luckless individual became a Wendigo himself, hunting down those he had once loved and feasting upon their flesh. And for the last description of a Wendigo I'm going to give you, and the description that happens to be my favorite one, comes from an Ojibwe teacher and scholar by the name of Basil Johnson. And he describes it as the Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tautly over its bones, with its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets. The Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, unclean and suffering from the suppuration of flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. As you can see, there is a lot of ways a Wendigo is described as appearing, and the three I gave you isn't even a quarter of all the variations of that. But regardless of there being a lot of different ways, almost all of them do share some similarities. They all share the similarities of they are much, much taller than the average human being, upwards of 15 feet tall. Its lips are missing or mostly missing, and behind those missing lips are razor sharp fangs for ripping through human flesh. So, needless to say, it's not the best kisser. And I can't believe I'm about to say this. To all you TikTokers out there hunting for the Wendussy, yeah, don't try it. Despite its emaciated appearance, it was incredibly strong, and on each of its hands had a set of razor sharp claws to go along with that strength. It had an absolutely insatiable appetite and would hunt and eat any human being it came across indiscriminately. Yeah, if I saw this out in the woods, it's no bye. So Wendigos are equally as scary physically as they are in their behavior and their nature. Part of the curse of being a Wendigo is that they have a ceaseless hunger, so they can never be satiated, and this makes them incredibly voracious. They're also incredibly cunning, If they are hunting a group of people, they will actually isolate them and pick them off one by one. And one of the more scarier parts is they know every single inch of their territory. And when I say every single inch, I mean inch. Like, there is no hiding from a Wendigo. Anywhere you would possibly think of to hide, the Wendigo is going to find you there. And a good example to look into a Wendigo's nature is actually to look back at what Father Lejeune wrote. You know, he wrote that it would kill everyone in the French fort if it wasn't called elsewhere. Now, when you start to take all these traits, you know, not just physically, but also its behavior, and you really start to think about it, you start to realize just how terrifying it would be to be hunted by a Wendigo. Like, just let's set the scene. You're out in the middle of the woods and you know one of these things are coming after you. You can't hide. There is no hiding from this thing. And you can only run for so long. Meanwhile, this 10, 15-foot murder machine with claws is just coming after you. There's nothing you can do about it. If you run, you are only going to die tired. Although, I wonder if anybody has tried to, like, just turn around, just look at it dead in its eyes, and just be like, Wendy, no go. Wendy, stop. Wendy, stop. Wendy, stop. Yeah, but I got you all rolling on the floor laughing with that one. I'm an absolute comedy genius. But, anyways, what I'm going to talk about now is one of the various creation stories of the Wendigo. And let me preface this with the creation of a Wendigo, or at least the story behind it, is really dependent on a tribe's tradition and values. And a lot of tribes don't actually believe the Wendigo exists. It's more of a cautionary tale or a tale to just reinforce a tribe's traditions and values. And just as there is 101 ways to describe a Wendigo physically, there are equal many ways for how one of these creatures is created. So, one of the ways that these tribes describe as a Wendigo is being created is actually when an individual is overcome with greed. And this is one of those tales where they don't necessarily believe the Wendigo exists. It purely exists as a cautionary tale. And this tale was meant to promote self-moderation and just cooperation with one's community. Some people actually believe that just being in the presence of a Wendigo for too long can transform somebody. And this is a lesson in just be careful of the company you keep. Now, the most common creation story for a Wendigo, and the one people who've heard of a Wendigo before are most familiar with, is they're created through an act of cannibalism. And I'm sure I don't need to, you know, actually explain what the moral behind this is. It's just eating people bad. So, you know, if you're out on a hike with your friends, you get caught in a blizzard or something, and, you know, you run out of food, and all of a sudden your friend starts to look really juicy and double caked up. Don't eat them, because if you eat them, you be Wendigo now. One of the more interesting creation tales for a Wendigo comes from the Athabascan language family, which is any of the tribes around the Peace Lakes area of Canada. And they actually call it a Washuga, which for all intents and purposes, it is a Wendigo. It's just in a geographically different spot, and it does have a somewhat kind of specific method of being created. The way you get a Washuga is when an individual commits a taboo. And there are a lot of these taboos. It really, once again, it really depends on which people you're talking to. And what happens is they commit one of these taboos and it opens them up to one of the giant spirit animals. And one of these giant spirit animals possess them, and then they become what is simply described as being too strong, and that's when the transformation into the Washuga Wendigo happens. And this is when you realize why I found it to be so interesting. It comes down to what some of these tribes see as being taboos. For example, some of them see flash photography being as a taboo. So if you're going to take a selfie, you better have that flash off, or you're going to become one of these. Another one is simply listening to music made with any instrument that was made with stretch, string, or hide. So that can include guitars and drums. So, sorry, Nickelback. And yet another one is eating meat with fly eggs in it, which I mean just absolutely gross. So, after all that, you can really start to see how the tale of the Wendigo is more of a cautionary tale. It's a lesson, and it's a lesson in not succumbing to greed, to uphold a tribe's traditions and values, to cooperate with the community. And the Wendigo is seen more as a consequence for not doing these things. But some people have also attributed the Wendigo to just be an overall general symbol of greed and corruption. More specifically, some people see it as a symbol for the European colonization of North America. And it represents the self aggrandizing greed and the consumption of resources perpetuated by the European colonists. I was trying to find recent written accounts of Wendigo sightings for all of you. Unfortunately, I came up really short on that front. The most recent one I could find was from July of last year being 2021. And it comes from a man named Tanner. And yeah, this is his account of a Wendigo sighting. I had never heard of a Wendigo monster before today. I am 18 years old right now.
And I had saw what I think what people call was a Wendigo monster when I was 9 years old with my brother. We lived on a mountain and we were on our driveway with our uncle, and he had stopped to do something, and me and my younger brother got the dog out of the car to walk it. The dog got away from us and ran up the embankment, barking at something. So me and my brother climbed up to go and get him. He stopped and we grabbed a leash, and I looked up towards where the dog was going. About 15 yards away is what looked like stomach guts in a tree and an almost skull face of a deer with antlers and solid black eyes looking right back at me. I saw that for a second and turned to my brother, wondering if he had seen the same thing. His eyes were wide, and I could tell by his face that he had seen it too. We had both looked back and it was completely gone. This happened within seconds. I see it, and I look towards my brother and then look right back, and it's just gone. No sound at all, just completely gone. So we immediately ran back down the hill and back to our uncle.
Shout out and a big thank you to my friend Decline for reading that. Now, I don't believe Tanner actually spotted a Wendigo for multiple reasons. While modern media and pop culture like to depict a Wendigo as having a deer skull for a head, I couldn't actually find any Native American lore that describes it as such. I mean, it might be out there, I just personally haven't seen it. Also, the fact it ate his dog, apparently, when there was clearly human prey around. At the same time, nothing states a Wendigo wouldn't go and hunt non human prey, but Wendigos are pretty bloodthirsty for human flesh. At the same time, nothing says it couldn't have been a Washuga, which like I said, for all intents and purposes, is a Wendigo, just one created through someone being possessed by a giant spirit animal. So who's to say those possessed don't take on some characteristics of the spirit that possessed them? Maybe Tanner came across an individual who was possessed by a giant deer spirit. What I have here now is something the Wendigo lends its name to, and it is what modern day psychiatry refers to as Wendigo psychosis. And what this is it is the ever growing and constant fear of becoming a cannibal while simultaneously seeing people as being edible. And the really unique and weird thing about it is it only affects people from the Great Lakes region of USA and Canada, and it usually onsets during the winter. So if you live in this area and it's the middle of winter and your neighbor seems to be licking their lips a lot when they look at you, you might want to think twice before passing it off as their lips simply being chapped. You just might end up being lunch. This is also one of those things that is highly debated as to whether or not it's a thing within the psychiatric community, but There are records dating back to 1634 where Wendigo psychosis is the explanation for someone's actions. And what kind of weird, spooky, morbid loving host would I be if I didn't share some of these accounts with you? So, the first one I have for you comes from a Jesuit relations document written back in 1661. And what was written in the document is as follows: What caused us greater concern was the intelligence that met us upon entering the lake, namely, that the men deputed by our conductor to summon the nations of the North Sea and assigning them a rendezvous where they were to await our coming, had met their deaths the previous winter in a very strange manner. Those poor men, according to the report given to us, were seized with an ailment unknown to us but not very unusual among the people we were seeking. They were afflicted with neither lunacy, hypochondria, nor frenzy, but have a combination of all these species of disease, which affects their imaginations and causes them a more than canine hunger. This makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men, like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously, without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily, the more they eat. This ailment attacked our deputies, and as death is the sole remedy among those simple people for checking such acts of murder, they were slain in order to stay the course of their madness. Could you imagine being on what was probably a routine journey to meet some people? You get there, you talk a bit, some casual small talk like, hey, how's the weather? How's the kids? And then you decide to just bring up, hey, what's for dinner? And you find out that your dinner. And now all of a sudden you have a whole damn gang of Florida men coming to munch on your face. No, thank you, goodbye. A rather infamous case of Wendigo psychosis is the case of Swift Runner. He was a man who was a Plains Cree trapper, and he also happened to work as a trader for the Hudson's Bay Company. And just for a little extra history, in 1975, he worked as a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police. He was married and he fathered 6 children. This is the very brief case of Swift Runner's Wendigo psychosis. During the winter of 1878 to 79, Swift Runner and his family were starving, along with numerous other Cree families. His eldest son was the first to die of starvation, and at some point, Swift Runner succumbed to Wendigo psychosis. Though emergency food supplies were available at Hudson's Bay Company Post, some 25 miles away, he did not attempt to travel there. Instead, he killed the remaining members of his family and consumed them. He eventually confessed and was executed by authorities at Fort Saskatchewan. Despite being a very brief summary on his psychosis, this caught my attention so hard, solely because it was entirely plausible for Swift Runner to make the journey to get the rations. He was used to the terrain since he was a trapper, and he's no stranger to the winters there. But his psychosis decided, nah, let's eat my wife. And let's eat little Timmy while we're at it. Ah, fuck it, let's eat them all. And what also makes it so weird is that one of the triggers, one of the speculated triggers for Wendigo psychosis is the need for survival. Yet there are plenty examples of people being in similar situations or even worse ones and never suffering from it. And once again, it only seems to affect people from the Great Lakes area. What I have for you now is the story of Jack Fiddler, an Cree chief and medicine man. Jack was known for his prowess in defeating Wendigos, and he himself claims to have defeated 14 of them in his lifetime. While he never suffered from Wendigo psychosis himself, he would often, and in air quotations, cure those who did. And sometimes that method of curing was through unaliving them. And this case revolves around what could be described as a mercy kill for a family. So this family was begging Jack to help one of their family members, but the case was deemed uncurable. And the only way to deal with that is, as mentioned, Jack unalived them. This would get Jack in trouble with the Canadian authorities. In 1907, Jack and his brother Joseph, who would often help him with these Wendigo cases, were arrested for murder. And while Jack was incarcerated, I gotta be careful with the wordage here. Jack left the Minecraft server while on one of his loud walks, self lassoing himself to an elevated object. Joseph was granted a pardon eventually, mostly on the grounds of being ignorant to Canadian law, and his actions were considered as a normal thing and a spiritual necessity for his people. But he did pass away 3 days before receiving word of his pardon. And while this isn't a case where the main person involved succumbed to Wendigo psychosis, it's still an interesting look into the culture and tradition of some of these people and how some of them actually found, one of their family members being unalived as being normal and preferable. Not that any of you can see my ridiculous note document here that I have in front of me, but we are almost to the end of this little lesson. So the Wendigo legend has spread pretty far, and we don't see it too infrequently in modern media. We see it in video games, movies, TV shows. There's even horror novels written about it. And at one point, it even appeared in the Marvel Incredible Hulk comics. The Incredible Hulk Volume 2, Issue 162 by Steve Englehart and Herb Trimpe, to be exact. And for the most part, while maybe not accurately representing them physically, they do a pretty good job on, how they're created and how they behave. And what is actually a really good example of how a Wendigo would hunt comes from the first season of Supernatural, I believe episode 2. Now, before you roll your eyes, let me explain. So, during the beginning and throughout the episode, we see the Wendigo slowly isolating the group of people and killing them off one by one. And it does a really good job at showing just how good of a hunter and how cunning they are. The only gripe I really have with it is, if I'm remembering correctly, it would save people as a snack for later, which a Wendigo would not actually do this. Like, all a Wendigo wants to do is find a person, unalive them, nom 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 them, move on to the next person to do the same. Although what has to be my favorite portrayal of a Wendigo comes from the video game, cue drum roll, Until Dawn. I'm going to try to explain why it's my favorite without spoiling anything, even though it's like a 5 or 6 year old game at this point. So, in the game, Wendigos are created through acts of cannibalism, and they are extremely murderous, constantly hunting down the main cast. And the game does a really good job at showing just how scary it would be to be hunted by a Wendigo. They also do an absolute fantastic job at showing them off physically, and they actually closely resemble how Basil Johnson describes them. They have the lipless mouths, the taut gray skin, and the emaciated look. You can see its bones pressing against its skin. And it would be the absolute perfect portrayal of a Wendigo if it weren't for the fact that they gave him the characteristics of a T-Rex, in that their perception was heavily based on movement. And I understand why they did this game mechanics. But other than that one little thing, it is the perfect portrayal of a Wendigo to me. And with that, my good people, we have reached the end. If you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I did digging around for all this info. And I hope it entertained you enough to return for the next episode of Unkindness. So for now, my fellow weird and creepy enthusiasts, this is goodbye. Keep it freaky, but keep it safe.